In the last video about the Star Wars Legion speeder truck, I got it painted. If you want to see that process, you can do the little clicky thing up here, if I remember to put that in there. If not, just go search on my channel. But now I want to start getting this thing weathered up. And my plan is I want it to be really dirty, really grimy, because if this is essentially a delivery truck converted into a military vehicle and it's riding around who knows where, chances are it's going to get pretty messed up. So let's mess it up. Now, the only preparation I've done since the last video was to give it a coat of VMS satin finish. I just airbrushed it on in a couple of coats. Now, I chose satin finish because, one, I'm not planning to put any decals on, so that might have made me opt for a gloss finish if I were going to put on a lot of decals. I'm not putting any on, so don't have to worry about that. Two, I'm going to be using oils, and oils work better over a satin or a gloss finish. My thinking is, if I choose my choice of one or the other in that case, is if I'm going for a cleaner finish, then I want to put a gloss coat on so that the cleanup of the oils, the cleanup of the enamels, whatever that type of product I'll be using, that's going to be a little easier. If I use a satin finish, then it gives it a little more grip and allows the oils to spread out a little more, the enamels to spread out a little more, and gives me a dirtier look. So I knew I was going for the dirtier look, so that drove my choice of the clear coat. Now, for the initial panel lining and griming and all of that stuff, I'm going to be using 502 Abtei-however Starship Filth, and this is just a good dark general color for panel lines, for doing oil effects. I mean, you can use it for streaks and stains and oils and oil spills and fluid spills. I mean, it just works all around. It's a great color to have. So I highly recommend not only the 502 Abtei-however oils in general, but this color in particular. For my thinner, of course, I'll be using odorless thinner. I'm going to use some of this odorless terpenoid from Weber. I get it in these big containers because they last forever, and get them at an art store. You can use the stuff from, say AK Interactive, the odorless thinner from them. You can use the Winsor & Newton Sansador. That works. Any odorless thinner works really well for cleanup on this. And then to help speed drying time, I'm going to use some of this VMS Oil Expert. Now, you can use this solely as your thinning medium. You don't have to cut it with odorless thinner or something like that. I tend to use a mix of the odorless thinner and this just to give me a little more drying time. But this will drastically reduce your drying time to the point that if you're not careful, if you're just using odorless terpenoid, you might be able to put some oils on there and then come back, half a day later and still work with it. You put some of this stuff in it, half a day later, you might be hurting. So if you get some of this, and I highly recommend it, if you get some of this, work with it to kind of see what the drying times are, and it'll help you. The benefit of this is you can get it in matte, satin, and high gloss effect. I got the matte effect, so this just helps matte down the paints even more if they're not already matte. So this is just some great stuff to add into your oils. And finally, for my brushes, I'm just going to be using some older synthetic brushes. These have seen better days. I don't use anything fancy. I'm not fancy. I'm an old grumpy paratrooper. So you don't see me using fancy stuff generally. I like using these synthetics because I can beat them up. I can do what I want with it, and doesn't make much of a difference. But you use whatever you want. All right, the way I set up my workspace is I've got some thinner in the palette here. I've got two wells that just have the plain odorless thinner. And then I have this one that has a mix of odorless thinner and the VMS Expert product, about half and half. The VMS is purple, but it doesn't really affect the color of the oils, so don't worry about that. I've got a piece of cardboard here that's got a piece of tape on the bottom to hold it in place so it's not sliding everywhere. I've got some of my Starship Filth on there, and got a piece of paper towel here. Got my brushes off to the side, and of course the model. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to get started doing panel lining. So I'm just going to make me a little bit of a slush here of oil. And all I'm doing really is just loading up oil, very thin oil on the brush. And I'm not going to worry if some of the color gets back over in here. That's just going to happen. The reason I don't make, you've seen a lot of guys that make a little tub full of oil or a little container full of oil or something like that, is I prefer generally to work with the oils a little thicker and not necessarily have them quite as flowy. So working from oils on a palette like this allows me to just get on there a little thicker, a little more control, because this way I can clean it up. There's a certain way I like to clean it up when I want the model to be grimy. I don't want to necessarily wipe it all off. I want to do some work with it while it's still on the model. This just gives me the flexibility to do that. Now, you can, of course, make your little container of oil and put it on there and just let it flow around. That works just fine. I'd say the main thing to be careful of is the observation I have is that most of the time when I've seen folks do that, even experienced creators on YouTube, they tend to overthin it quite often. And it breaks the pigments in the oil paints apart, and sometimes gives it a grainy look when it's dried. If you ever see somebody that has used oils for their panel lining, and it just looks, if you look at it up close, if it looks a little grainy and stuff like that, they probably overthinned the oils. So that's generally what's going on when you see that. Now, let me get that on there. Now, normally I would do a much larger part of the model for this. But for the sake of demonstration, I want to show you what I do as it's drying. I take a cotton bud like that, just dip it over in my thinner, just lightly, damp off most of it on the paper towel. And then I just take this and I just kind of start pouncing along the line there. Now, you can clean it up as much as you want. I could wipe this stuff off fairly easily. You can blend it back in. You can go back later and refine it with a brush. I mean, these oils, you have the opportunity to work with them pretty well. But if you want a really grimy look, this is where you get that. I'm taking the dry end and just touching up the line, pulling it in towards the line. Again, because of the drying time, the oils let you do this. Any places like right there, you see how I pulled up too much oil? The oil came, because it's still wet. Normally I would let it dry a little bit. You see how the oil came up like that? All you got to do is, once everything has dried for just a few minutes, it doesn't take long. Once everything is dried for just a few minutes, then what you can do is go back and just drop in a little more oil there, clean that up. But what's happening is the Q-tip, the damp Q-tip, is lifting up some of the oils, thinning it out a bit, but it's just leaving a really grimy, beat up look. And that's pretty much the process. It works. I wouldn't use this necessarily, say, on an aircraft. probably gives you a little more grime than you want when it comes to an aircraft. When you see that start happening, that it's not taking up much oil, that's when you know you need to switch Q-tips. You'll go through a lot of Q-tips using this method. But see, when I switch Q-tips, now it starts taking it up again. But I think for sci-fi stuff, for armor, for, certainly like Warhammer vehicles or something like that, this is great. You can just stipple the oils across like that. It gives you, I love using oils because you can get so many effects with them. And so much of it is what I'd call serendipitous, to use a $64 word. You just kind of let the weathering dictate itself. And you're just there to kind of herd it in a general direction. But I think doing that gives it a much better look. I want to clean that little part off. I'm going to get it soaked on there and there we go. See, again, very easy to use. You're just using thinners and oil and just moving it around. This takes a little more time, but to me, that extends the fun. I've always said, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Well, to me, this is the fun part. The assembly, that's not the fun part. The base painting, that's not the fun part. This right here, this is the fun part. So now, like that little area there that I mentioned, that I had missed getting, I pulled up too much of the color in. All I'll do is just go back here, touch it back in very lightly, just like that. Maybe a little more right there. And just touch it up and move on to the next section. Now for areas like around these where I want a more traditional pen wash, what I like to do there a lot of times is just pre-wet it with oil. And because I've got some oil on my brush, it may give me enough to do a good pen wash. Yeah, that'll work. And I just put it around there and let that flow around. I'll just let that sit and just touch off some here. See how that just flows right in there? The drawback of oils is there is more drying time than would be associated with acrylics. But the advantage of oils is this just easy workflow and the ability to kind of just configure it however you want. So you have to balance out what it is you're trying to do. If you're doing miniature painting and you're trying to build an entire army in a couple of weeks so you can go play somewhere, you probably don't want to spend a whole lot of time messing with oils. But if you're building for, you just wanted to take time on that one particular model, they're awesome. Now, sometimes you may have something on the surface like this that you want to get some lining done around it, but you also want it to be very shadowed, very dirty, to look like grime has got up in there and really just really made that area dirty. So what I'll do is in this case, earlier I was using a liner brush, cheap synthetic liner brush. This one I've moved to a very old Rosemary & Co. Red Dot size 2. It's a synthetic brush. I'm just going to wet it in the thinners, but then I'm going to work off most of it. And then I just want to take some of this oil paint and I'm just going to put it on here without much thinning at all. And I'm going to get pretty heavy with it like that. And just go all the way around with it. Now, once I've got that all the way around there, I'm going to go back to my palette of thinner. I'm going to clean off a little bit of the excess paint. I don't mind if there's some on there. It's not a big deal. But I just want to clean off most of the excess. And then I'm going to get the brush fairly wet. I'm just going to go in here and start pushing that oil around, just blending it. Now it's going to look really ugly at this stage. That's okay. I want to start blending it, wiping it off, thinning it out. The idea will be to leave a fairly grimy mess around and it's just back and forth between the palette, the thinner, the paper towel, and the model. And you just start kind of configuring it like you want. Every now and then, get you a Q-tip, start working it in, blending that out. But the goal is to just really, really heavily beat that area up. Because, my idea is I'm guessing this is some kind of air intake, so there's going to be stuff swirling around it, and it's going to get dirty and nasty and all of that kind of stuff. So that's why I want it to be dirty. You can do effects similar to this certainly with enamels. Anything I'm doing here with oils, you can do with enamels, generally. I'm always careful to say everything because somebody's always going to drop a comment and go, yes, but you were aware that if you were at the equator on the 31st of August and a red Volkswagen's driving by, no, I wasn't aware of that. Thanks for the tip. But anyway, yeah, that's the way to attract comments, John. But generally, anything I'm doing with oils, I can do with enamels. I just don't use enamels very much because every time I get enamels, if I go, say a year between using them, because I tend to use acrylics more than anything, after a year, those enamels are dried up. And I've just never had good luck with that. But anyhow, you could do this in similar fashion with acrylics. I mean, you have to do, as I've talked about in videos before, oils and enamels are a subtractive method. You put it on and then you take off what you don't want. Acrylic weathering is generally an additive method in that you put the stuff on and then you build it up to get the effect that you want. So you have to work accordingly, according to whatever product you choose to work with. And sometimes I combine the two. Sometimes I'll put down a base of acrylics because they dry fast, and then go in and refine the look with oils or, enamels or something like that. But the idea that I like with oils is I can do this. I can just keep blending. I can keep working with it. I can keep working an area, and just really make it look like I want. And if you really mess it up, you can go in, flood the area with oil, and start over. Now, if you're wondering, John, are you doing oil paint rendering? Well, I don't know that I would call it oil paint rendering. I mean, I guess in its loosest definition it is. I jokingly have always said to truly do oil paint rendering, you have to have a knit cap pulled down low and partially covering one ear, and you have to have a very fancy and expensive latte sitting off to the side. And I say that joke with great respect. But this is just putting paint on. That's all it is. I mean, yeah, I'm working it around, I'm blending it, I'm doing different things with it, but all I'm doing is putting paint on. There is nothing fancy about this. There's nothing mysterious about this. I know we give things names to just so that people know what you're talking about. If I say dry brushing, you immediately know what I'm talking about. If I say panel lining, you immediately know what I'm talking about. But getting there with those things there can be a variety of ways of getting there. So in a strict sense, I guess this is or a loose sense rather. I guess this is oil paint rendering. I just think it's putting paint on a model. I'm using oils. But you see how grimy that looks? Now I'll let that set up a little bit, reevaluate it, and go back in and make any adjustments. I can work on this for a few hours before the oil expert dries it out for me. If it's drying it out too fast, then switch to using one of the wells of just the odorless thinner. So the more you do it, the more experience you'll get with it. All right, you can see how that looks, and I can fine tune it a little bit. It's still a little bit wet, so I'm gonna let it dry for just a little while. I'm gonna have to go off to work here in just a minute, but I'll let that dry for just a little while, and then make any adjustments. But it's just a real great way of making things look really ultra grimy and easy to do. And if you were wanting it to look more dirty than grimy, you could use a burnt umber or something like that, a brownish color. If you wanted it to look dusty, you could use a tan color, some kind of dust colored oil. And you can combine them. You know, I could let this dry, and I probably will, and then go in later with some kind of dust color because I'm going to want this to look like it's a bit dusty. So I'm going with that and combine different colors together. So there's a lot of ways of making it happen. All right, with the initial oil work done, I want to do some chipping. Now for this, I'm going to use 2 parts buff, 1 part black gray, both of these from Vallejo, and send it with just a little water, probably 1 part water, 2 parts paint. You work out what works best for you, and then I'm going to start off with a sponge, just a piece of packing sponge, and I'm just going to dip into this. Now I use this color because I want it to look like a steely gray kind of color. I'm not going for something that looks like it's a ferrous material. Otherwise I would be doing something that's more brown in its presentation. This is a warm gray. Now this can represent a composite underneath. It can represent a whole lot of different things. It can represent whatever you want. It can represent nothing. It can just be a color that you like. But I like this because I'm thinking that this is some kind of composite material, some kind of futuristic space material. Well, I guess technically it's, a long time ago, but it was a galaxy far, far away, and they were futuristic compared to us. So, but I want to use this just because it's not rusty looking. Now, just because you use a color that doesn't imply a ferrous or rusty kind of material underneath doesn't mean you still can't have rust stains. You can add those because if you've ever looked at something that's, not necessarily made of stuff that will rust, you can still see rust streaks. If you've ever seen an old fence, wood doesn't rust, but you may see rust stains on it where there's been nails put in it, and those nails will streak. The metal will rust, and it will create a rust-colored streak coming down from that area. So you can make something rusty with even if it's representing a composite material or something like that. Now, when I'm putting on the chipping, sometimes I think density and distribution, and I try to think about, okay, where would it chip versus where would it not chip? What's going to be more heavily chipped than not? Something like on this vehicle, something close to the ground is going to get more heavily chipped because of all the things being kicked up as it floats along above the ground. Whereas up top, you might not have as much chipping. You can use chipping to do some edge highlighting to help suggest the edges and the shapes and the volume. But to be honest, on this one, I'm just going to chip it because I'm having fun chipping. I'm not necessarily worried if it makes sense. I'm not worried if somebody will look at this and go, that's too heavily chipped. I'm not worried if somebody says it looks like you chipped it with a potato stamp because it's the same pattern over and over. I'm having fun. So that's my excuse. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So you do the chipping however you're motivated to do it.
to achieve the result that you want. I want this to convey a dirty, beat up speeder truck. You know, that's what I'm trying to convey. So if somebody looks at that and they say, wow, that thing's worn out, well, then I've done my job. If somebody looks at it and says, well, you know, according to Star Wars lore, that's not the pattern that would chip with on that particular planet, I'm going to go, don't care. Don't care, dude. Have fun or you're doing it wrong. So anyway, let me get this sponge chipping done. And notice, I mean, I'm doing it kind of heavy down here for obvious reasons, but sometimes you can just lightly put it in there like that and just represent surface scratches and abrasions and chips and things like that. So put it on and let the rule of cool drive your motivation for how you're doing it. Now, just a few other random thoughts as I work through this. If you're going to choose to do the two-color chipping method, which for this model I just decided not to, just simply because I didn't want to. I didn't want to get that complicated with it. And the two-color chipping method is where generally you use a lighter color than the base to represent surface scratches, and then darker color to represent chipping that goes down to the underlying material. You have to think about contrast there and what's going to work in terms of picking your colors. You want to make sure that the lighter colored chipping, or the chipping that's the variation of the base, is light enough that you can see the difference. Sometimes I've tried to pick a very clever color scheme and would end up out clevering myself, and you just couldn't see the lighter layer of chipping. Then you also got to think about, okay, if you're going to use the darker one, what order works best. Sometimes you can put on the darker chipping and then paint in the lighter chipping around it, depending on the effect you want. If you want to do the lighter chipping first, then you would go in and generally paint in the darker chips in the middle of some of the chips. Now, sometimes what I do is I use a sponge for the lighter chips, and then I use a sponge for the darker chips. And I let them, some places overlap, and some places one supersedes the other, and then I can go back with a brush if I want to and correct any areas that I don't think look quite right. So there's a lot of ways of doing it. And the beautiful thing is, on most models, you can try slight variations of the technique. If you've never done it, try slight variations of the technique on one side or the other. And, in the end, it'll probably look fine overall, but you'll get some idea of what works, what doesn't for any particular thing, and which one you end up liking best. Another thing I like to think about is that every chip tells a story. I mean, if you think about, if this were a real object, whatever chipped this was a specific point in time, a specific thing that did it. Whatever did here. It may have been built up over time. A little comes off, and then another mission, a little more comes off, another mission, a little more comes off. But sometimes I like to think, okay, let me do a story chip. Let me do a chip that, like right here, I'm going to do one that is really heavy, and I may develop a reason for and put some visual clues to kind of give an indication of why that's there. Sometimes I think it's okay to just put something that invites the viewer to tell their own story. If somebody says, well, why is it chipped so heavy there? I say, well, why do you think? I think part of being a modeler is in some ways being a storyteller. And so telling the story of what happened to your vehicle, I think kind of makes it fun for the person looking at it. They get to participate, so to speak, in what's going on. What do you think happened? Where do you think this is going? Why is it this way? And let their imagination rule with it. So I probably overthink some of these things, but I think that's part of the fun. It's part of the enjoyment. You know, even when I was building aircraft, I always thought about what would it be like to sit in this thing. I imagined myself sitting. Anytime I built a cockpit, I imagined myself sitting in it, you know, wondering at my height. I'm 6'4". You know, could I fit in there? Would my knees bump into things? How would this, how would this feel? How tight is this? How wide is this? And I think the more you try to inject yourself into whatever it is you're building, the more you're going to enjoy the process. Chipping is also a great way of correcting any painting mistakes you've made. Like I should have pointed it out, but there was some red paint that had gotten over here that should not have been there. But I knew when it got to the chipping process that I could do as I just did, which was cover up that errant paint. So all you've got to do is not panic and just think, okay, on later steps, what can I do here to make this work? Always knowing that it's a process and there's really no final point, I think. I think you just kind of get to a spectrum of finishing. Okay, I'm starting into the area that it's looking about like I want, and then at some point, you'll know it when you see it. That's what helps me sleep at night, at the very least. Another random thought came to me. Sometimes it's fun. I'm not going to do it on this model, just because I want this thing to be completely chipped and beat up, and there's still a lot more work to do on this thing. But what can be fun is if you're chipping a model fairly heavily, but then you find one panel or maybe a couple of them, and you either mask over them so there's no chipping on them, or after everything's chipped, you go back and paint over it with a color of paint that makes it look like it's obviously been repainted or replaced or something like that. I remember one time I built a Spitfire based on an actual photo, and one of the gun covers on the wings was a natural metal finish because at some point they'd had to replace that gun cover, and the one that it came from was either a Spitfire with a silver or natural metal finish, probably painted silver, but a silver finish, even though the rest of the bird was camouflaged and they hadn't painted over it. And so it just kind of stood out, but it looked kind of cool. So, you can look for ways, even as you're making something dirty, that if you just throw in a clean spot here or there, again, it's all part of telling the story of your vehicle and, leaving room for speculation about why does it look the way it does, and what's it been doing, and how does it fit into the world that it's in. Now, just briefly, in case the question comes up, I want to address why I did the oil work first and then the chipping second. Because I could have done the chipping first because it's acrylics. It would have dried real quick. I could have gone over it with the oils. I could have done a lot of the acrylic work first and then gone over it with the oils. The reason I did not do that is oils, when you put them over something, they will quite often stain what's underneath it. So if I would have put this chipping color on without sealing it, then when I put the oils on, it may have darkened them down quite a bit more than I wanted them to be. So by putting on the oils first, I can put chipping on over it. In any places that it diminishes the oils, I can go back and do spot corrections with the oils or even with an acrylic wash. But if you were going to do the acrylic work first and leave the oils for last or near last so that you didn't have to worry about the drying time early on, then after you got the acrylics on and they were dried and cured, then you would probably want to seal it with a matte coat or a gloss coat so that there was no interaction between the oils. The oils won't activate the acrylics. There's no problem with putting oils over acrylics unless the acrylics aren't dried, but it can stain them. So that's why I did it in the order that I did, just to avoid that staining interaction, because I wanted very much for this steely gray color to kind of come through. Next, I'm going to use this Rosemary & Co. It's a Pure Sable Series 88, and you'll notice that it's a very thin liner brush. And I like these because they give you a very, very fine point, give you very good control, but the brush is long enough to hold some paint so you can actually do some work and not have to return to the palette every brush stroke. But what I do here is I just go in and I put in streaks. It can be a single streak like that. It can be joining some already sponge applied chips together. It can be stippling on a pattern that you want. Whatever you think it needs to be. It can just be a quick straight line, because anytime something is getting chipped, there's things can drop. Somebody can be up on top of the vehicle and drop a tool and it bangs down the side and it does something like that, So that's where, Private Snuffy dropped his wrench when he was fixing whatever the thing is up here. There can be other places where, a rock hits and just scratches right along just like that. And it doesn't have to be parallel to the line of travel. It can be from different angles. It can represent a lot of different things. If you want, like this is going to be on a base, sitting on a base with a stand and all of that. If you want it to impart a sense of speed, then having more chips that are moving along this way is going to kind of give it, sell to the brain that this thing is moving. Other times, if you wanted to sit more still, you may do things that are more vertical in nature, less chipping, maybe some vertical chips, but more streaks vertically and things like that. So you can impart a lot of different things just by putting on the chips. Another thing I like to do at this stage is if there's an area that I had trouble getting to with the sponge, say right up in here, well then I can just go into it with this and just stipple on tiny little points like that. And it's going to simulate, it's going to look pretty close to what the sponge would have done, but it'll let me get into some areas that I couldn't get into with the sponge without getting way too much paint on there. So this can take a little longer to do this, but it gives you way, way more control than the sponge does. There have been times on models that I did the whole model with a brush like this. It takes forever, but you literally control the placement of every chip. It works good on smaller models. It works good on specific areas. If you watched Martin Kovach on Night Shift Scale Models, he did I can't remember the tank, but he said it took like 70 hours of work because he did all brush chipping. To quote the famous internet meme, ain't nobody got time for that. I love his work, but I'm like, brother, you got more patience than I got. I want to get stuff done. So I like to do the sponge and then just go in and refine it with a brush like that. Now, if you don't have a brush like this, just find one with a good pointy tip and thin your paints down a little bit more than you would with the sponge application. I added just a little bit of water to it, and it helps it flow off the brush a little better. I didn't add any flow aid. I didn't add any retarder, drying retarder to it. I didn't do anything like that. I'm just using paint and water here. And, if you add other things, that's fine. But remember earlier I talked about if you find places that you made a mistake earlier, there's a little bitty spot of red paint right there. And what I always say is if you get some paint like that out of place, all that's doing is marking where one of the chips is going to be. So there, covered up the red paint. What mistake? I didn't make a mistake there. Something else to point out, if you're doing brush chipping like this, it's best to use the side of the brush rather than going directly in at something, because if you just start pouncing it directly onto the model, you'll probably shorten the life of your brush way too much. You'll get a hooked tip. Now, if you're just using a cheap synthetic for something like this, like I've got a jar of these type of liner brushes that are like 10 cents a piece, and I got like 100 of them. If you're using that, hey, beat it up, you toss it out, get another one. But when it's my nicer brush, I tend to use the side, and it gives me a little more control. It lets me do very, very fine work. And if I want it to be thicker, then all I have to do is just add more pressure. So I can start here and then just push harder, and it just deposits more paint. And I can go back in and refine that and do whatever I want with it. Just be aware that very rarely, unless it's, a technique using a brush kind of like this, where pouncing straight down onto the model with the brush is a good idea. Now I want to start adding some environmental effects. Dirt, dust, grime, all of that. I'm imagining that this is going to be operating in what I'm terming a high desert environment, meaning very deserty, very dry, but also very cold. So on the base, there's going to be not only desert, but snow. Why did I pick that? I don't know. It seemed cool to me. But for the desert look, to get started on this, I'm going to use this Vallejo Model Wash Desert Dust. And I've thinned it about 1 part water, 2 parts of the Model Wash. I'm actually going to apply this with a sponge. Just dip some in there, dip off a good bit of that, and then just start putting it on. I think I got off a little too much. There we go. And just put it on. Now you'll notice that it runs like that. But what I do is as I start putting it on, I just kind of work it around. In other words, the model in a way becomes the palette. So if I need more, I just go back, and I can use the side of the sponge to dry it up a little bit like that. But I just work it around like this. Now this stuff will dry fairly quick. And so what I'm going to do is just let that initial layer dry and then go back and see how it looks and keep building it up. Now in my thinking, I'm going to have more towards the bottom part of it than I am on the upper part. And I can go back and I can use this same product to do streaks and things like that. Now, my color choice here is actually deliberate because most of the exterior of this model is a very cold color, bluish, grayish, and all of that. I've got this red stripe, that's warm, but I'm using this because it's in contrast to that grayish color, so it's going to stand out. I'll be able to really make it look streaky and dusty and dirty with this wash. Now I could do this with oils. I could do this with enamels. I'm choosing acrylics here simply because it dries fast. So you pick what you think is going to fit the needs that you want your model, like I talk about, the story that it wants to tell, and pick the product that's going to serve your needs. Don't let the product run you. You run the product. The more you're in control of the product, the more you understand about how it works, how it doesn't work, and what its strengths and weaknesses are, the more fun you're going to have because you will be much more in control of the process. Now, as you're adding your layers on, you can take some of the wash and your liner brush and just add in some dust around some of the features. Again, you just put a little on, let it dry, see if you want to add more or if that particular application does what you want. Doesn't have to be around everything, just to suggest dust collecting. A liner brush is also a great way if you just want to introduce some streaks, just some quick streaks down like that. And if you thin the paint out a lot, it really gives you a lot of control over how that's going to look. Now, this step is lightening down the chips, but that's okay because, I'm thinking the dust is going to be a constant. The dust, as soon as it goes out, it's going to get dusty. It's going to be riding around, it's going to get dusty, so it's going to cover up a lot of the chips, and I'm okay with that. However, if you want some of the chips to remain more prominent after you get your dust on, you can go around and select a few areas of chipping to enhance those a little bit. Same way with the panel lining, any of it. You can you can do this in layers of some panel lining, some chipping, some dust, some panel lining, some chipping, some dust, and just keep building up on the depth of the finish. The greater the depth of the finish, the better the model is going to look, I think. It's going to really give it a nice look, especially in terms of realism. It takes more time, but I think it just really gives a great look to it. What I'm doing now is as I'm adding more on, I'm focusing on the lower areas. I want them to be dustier than the areas up here. You see up here I didn't put a lot of dust, but down here I want a lot more. Now, the reality is the thing would be covered in dust, but I don't want it to be a dust bucket. I want it to be a beat up bucket, a leak bucket, a rust bucket, but not a dust bucket. So if I put enough dust down here, the brain is going to interpret this as being in a dusty area, even if I don't have the whole thing covered in dust. All right, here you can see how that's coming along, and the dust is definitely there. It's subtle. You have to, with this product, it's generally much more opaque when it goes on than when it dries. So it allows you to really build it up and kind of see what you're doing. It takes a little longer, but it's a trade-off. If you do, say you do oils and enamels, you may be able to build it up faster, but then you have to wait for it to dry. In this one, it dries really quick, and you have to just take a little more time to build it up. So it ends up being 6 in one, half a dozen of the other. But I'm pretty happy with this so far. I've still got to do all the other sides, and keep going with it. So there's still quite a bit to do. And I realize as I look at the time that I've put into this particular video that I'm just not going to get everything in that I want to get done in one video. So to spare you having to sit through a 2-hour video of me weathering this thing, I'm going to call this part 1. I hadn't intended to, but that's where we're at, so I'm okay with it. So this will be part 1 of weathering the speeder truck. We've covered using the oils for the panel lining and staining, initial staining. Then we've talked a lot about the chipping, both sponge and brush, and now going into the initial earth effects. In the next one, I'm going to continue doing the earth effects. There's going to be streaks and stains, fluid stains, things like that. There's going to be some final adjustments, and then maybe going back and adding a little of everything already been added to just finish up the look. So the part 2 of this shouldn't take, I know it's been a long time between the base painting and this weathering video. I don't plan for part 2 to take near that long, but because I'm going to just continue filming from when I stop here. I'm going to do the editing, get done with that, and then get right back to it. So I'm just going to continue on with this. But thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for the comments that you leave, the questions, all of that stuff. I'm always happy to answer questions if I can be of help. Always glad to do it. And of course, thank you to the patrons who support this channel. You're a great support to me and my family. So with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. So happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.